Well, good morning for those of you who are awake. Luckily, you don't see the title of the file, because if you could, you would see that it's probably version 5 or 6 of this talk, which changed dramatically in the last 48 hours as I was getting closer and closer to realizing that what I was going to present was so out of place. So this is the result of some intense feedback from many of you, and especially Kia, the person who's normally responsible for most of my ideas anyway. The advantage of having a neuroscientist at home. Now, when Jacob invited me, and I would like to thank him and Alan for this challenge, unfortunately, they were extremely kind. They say, well, no, there's something interesting that you think is relevant. You know, just zero constraints. And now freedom is hugely overvalued. You want to be told what to do, and then you know that whatever mistake you make, you can always blame Jacob. No, he said so. He said that that's what we need to do, and so not my fault. But once you're told, no, it's a blank check, whatever you want, that's fine. So, then I'm in trouble. So I take full responsibility for once for what is going to be presented today. Now, the title became quite obvious. The ephemeral nature of the permanent self presented itself as a natural topic that I could contribute to this. But going into the presentation, I thought I could start with a methodological perspective first, to tell you why this is version 6 or 7 of my talk. There are many ways of doing philosophy, and most of them are fine. One way is to try to remove as opposed to add. Some of you will be reminded of Michelangelo, the art of sculpturing as opposed to painting. When you sculpture something, you remove. When you paint, you add. I took the road a long time ago from Rome of being a philosophical sculptor as opposed to a philosophical painter, of operating in my intellectual development by removing. And then I met someone who actually said that way better than I could possibly formulate it. Samuel Beckett, being asked why he had started writing in French, he said, in French of course, to impoverish myself even further. Now this impoverishment of your intellectual sort of legacy is what I've been aiming at for the past 25 years. And I had to say that, especially yesterday, I realized that I might have overdone it. That at some point I might have overstepped from impoverishment to being poor, which is a different concept. So if you find that the rest of this half an hour or so is actually quite shallow and poor in concepts, that it doesn't scratch the surface, that in fact is a waste of your time, well, once again, there is no Jacob to blame for, it's just me. I might have overstepped the limit. The limit was called analytic philosophy, and it was called mathematical logic. As a young graduate student, moment of confession, I thought, how do you impoverish yourself intellectually? How do you make your life lean, no fat, only muscles? For some of us who are too keen on sport. Logic, the if-then. That's the only thing that matters, and that's the only thing you are ever going to use. What's the premise? What's the inference? What's the conclusion? And does the premise lead to the conclusion through that particular inference? If then, if then, if then. And then at that point, you know that you are lean and running fast. Unfortunately, you miss most of the world. And as I said yesterday, especially, it became quite clear that with all that if-then, culture has escaped the leaning moment. Now, with that out of the way, a bit of Plato to begin with. So I'd like to tell you something about the self, the nature of the self in the 21st century, and what happens to the nature of the self in a world dominated by digital technologies. Now, that's my area of work, the impact of the digital on human life. As you may imagine, is a rather, especially for philosophy, new area. That's the difference between Kia and myself. She works on the fraction of milliseconds, we work on centuries. The gap, temporally speaking, is quite huge. Now, in this particular case, philosophy hasn't done much on the digital yet, but it's one of the things that should certainly involve philosophers today. Most of the problems, philosophical problems, coming to us as new problems come from the information society, life online, what happens to privacy, what happens to copyright, what happens to who we are, the topic for today, when we live increasingly interacting with digital technologies. But as a philosopher, I tend to take the long run in order to jump forward. So to discuss it, let's talk about Plato first. Normally, the wider the gap, the longer the run-up has to be. Now, Plato, in his super famous, now the philosophers will be probably disgusted by any reference to this. This is, it's trivial stuff for anyone who's done any philosophy in his life or her life. Refers to the self or the I or the ego, and I'm going to be very generic about this, as this particular chariot with horses and a driver. We liken the soul to the composite nature of a pair of winged horses and a charioteer, and the rest is in front of you. What I found puzzling, and remember, now this is the logician speaking, now the simple-minded, the lean runner, is that for 25 centuries we've been obsessed with the nature of the horses and the charioteer. We'll be discussing what they are, what they do, how they interact. But actually, even in Hume, at some point, you find, although not in the terms that I'm going to use, a puzzle, which is, what's the chariot? Because if there is no chariot, if there is no infrastructure, nothing holds. In other words, the unity of the self, assuming that this multi-composite nature of the self, which could have easily Freudian interpretations, assuming that we are not a composite of many parts, what glues all these parts together? So here is what, in a computer science context, will be called a multi-agent understanding of the self. There are many agents, we are, many components, something keeps that together. The chariot and the tack are the structure that guarantees unity and coordination, which allow the system to be persistent and act as a single and continuous entity. So you yesterday, you today, you tomorrow, is the chariot that keeps this together. So that's why at some point I started talking about the self and the problem of the chariot. What the chariot is doing there, what it is exactly. And philosophy actually has a couple of answers to that, and that's how I want to move forward. If we coin a new word to talk about a theory of the self as egology, which is self-explanatory, or an ontology, an understanding of the intrinsic deep nature of the ego or the self, well, Plato's interests were entirely ethical, so he couldn't bother too much in sort of making clear his metaphor. He was interested in the life of the multi-agent system, the tripartite self, the two horses, the charioteer. But today we have a couple of approaches to that. One is diachronic. Remember, we want to know how this system keeps working as a unity. Remember the wholeness, the unity that we were discussing yesterday. One is diachronic, through time. You have an ontology of the ego or the self as a philosophy of personal identity. It's the identity that matters. Who can say that you are the same you were last year? So how you re-identify something through time and possible worlds in different circumstances, for example. But the other one is synchronic. Or what does it mean to be that particular self as opposed to another self? And therefore the emphasis is on personal as opposed to identity. How you characterize in time a individual. Now these two views, through time or in time, characterization or re-identification, have in their turn further branches. And I'm giving you a 101 philosophy of mind for beginners here. Forgive me for those of you who know this by heart. In terms of a diachronic or diatopic re-identification of the self, how do you know that you are the same you are in that particular picture, now taken 10 years ago? We got two positions. One is called endurantism, the other one is called perdurantism. Philosophers are particularly keen on isms, unfortunately. We think it gives us a sense of scientific nature. A self exists at each moment of its history, and the same self exists at each moment. That's therefore you endure through that. You're like a block of marble that goes through a river. No, At the other side of the river, you're still that block of marble. Or a pendurantism. A self is a four-dimensional, a bit of physics here, three for space, one for time, entity made up of a series of spatial and temporal parts. You look more like a movie, frames in that particular sort of time. Now, the debate between these two has been endless. We will not take care of that, because I believe that it doesn't matter. This is not about the self only. It has been with us since Theseus' ship. And if you haven't encountered Theseus' ships, which is kind of a classic in philosophy, is the equivalent of the Polish axe. This axe is my grandfather's axe. My father changed the handle and I changed the blade. So, is that really the same axe? How could that possibly be? I mean, there's nothing left of your grandfather's axe, nor the handle, nor the blade. The Theseus ship is the same thing. If you keep changing bits on that particular ship, at what point, no, that ship is Theseus' ship or not? Now, that's like us, with our cells. At what point we're no longer the same body? Now, because of this is an area that we don't want to talk about, let me actually concentrate on this synchronic nature. Remember, step back, two problems: how you identify a self through time, and how you know that is a self. These two interact. We don't discuss through time today. We'll discuss the characterization of the self, what it means to have that particular nature. So what is the nature of the self? Well, in this case too, we have a couple of alternatives. One comes all the way back from John Locke. Well, the self is really a matter of consciousness. And consciousness is really a matter of memory. Eliminating memories, there's no consciousness, there's no self. So once you have someone with Alzheimer, well, you know that something has left that individual. Full Alzheimer, as I saw it with my own eyes, means that that individual is no longer there. The self has disappeared somehow. It melted in a way that is irrecoverable. Because there are no more memories, there's no more consciousness. That's called that the Lockean view. No? The other one is more contemporary. It's about narrative. And it doesn't have a single philosopher to be named after, so we call it the narrative approach. The self really is a socio-autobiographical artifact. It's part, for example, of my language, which allows me to be myself through my language. The limits of my world are the limits of my language and vice versa, in a sort of more Wittgensteinian way, but also true about myself. I am the culture, the language, etc., that constitutes me, and also all the contribution that I made through that. Now, pick up these two. Remember, first roundabout, we went synchronic. We abandoned the diachronic. Second roundabout, John Locke, narrative. Well, this second roundabout really has a commonality. Because if you talk about the Lockean approach, I am my own memories, my own consciousness, that's one way of making sense of the self. Or, which is not necessarily a either or, it could be and or. I'm also my stories, my narrative, what the world tells me I am and what I tell the world I am. Well, either of this have in the background information, and an information management that requires deep skills. So I believe that that's one of the theses I want to put forward, that 1 and 2, these two positions about the nature of the self, presuppose the existence of an individual agent endowed with the right sort of informational skills. Lose those, and it becomes very difficult to have either a Lockean approach or a narrative approach. And here, something should click with what I said about 5 minutes ago. Oh, if the nature of the self is about managing information, and through history we have specialized in technologies that manage information, at some point these two lines will cross each other, and we will have enormously powerful technologies that handle information in a way that is deeply affecting the individuals who develop those technologies. To put it in a more sort of Foucault way, digital technologies are ego-poietic, or, no, without the Greek, they are there to build, construct, modify the self. It's like having developed the most powerful self-making technologies that humanity has ever seen in our own life. So I won't discuss this, but no surprise that today you can't escape talking about privacy, for example, something that we did for millennia. But back to our topic. So here are the three theses for the rest of the talk. First of all, I shall assume the logical primacy of the characterization of the self over identification. You need to know what you're talking about before being able to say it is the same. You need to talk about a particular car, say, in order to say, oh, that's the same car that I saw at the car park. Not characterization, not problem with identification. So we have focused, as I said, on characterizing the self in the synchronic sense. Then an information interpretation of that. The problem of characterization and the problem of identification are problems that got to do with the informational nature of the self, and therefore with the technologies as well that handle that. And finally, how to discuss all this from a reflective perspective, because otherwise it means that you never read any German philosophy. Never do any philosophy without thinking that you are also doing philosophical work which needs to be consistent with your conclusions. In a sort of language, meta-language game, your language better be consistent with your meta-language and vice versa. So at some point at the end of this presentation, we will have to go back to realizing what are we doing here when the self, in this particular case me, is talking about the self as an informational, etc. How this sort of mirrors back to understand itself. And because all this is complicated and time flies, here is a reminder from the same great philosopher. To tell what it really is, the form of the soul or the characterization of the self, would be a matter of utterly superhuman and long discourse. Long, we don't have the time. Superhuman, not me, certainly. But it is within human power, which I hope I have here with you, to describe it briefly in a figure. Let us therefore speak in that particular way. Or to mention a great Oxford alumnus, Oscar Wilde, from now on we need to play gently with ideas. A beautiful phrase that, since I encountered a long time ago, has stayed with me to describe what philosophy should be doing. To play gently with ideas. That's what we need to do, to understand the characterization of the self at an age of information technologies. So ICTs as technologies of the self, of course, interact with the self in a variety of ways, through interactions, through memory, time, space, embodiment, the digital gaze. There is no time for all that. Remember Plato? No, we don't have all that time, and I need to be rather gentle, not least because I want to discuss all this from a logical realization, so I shall skip most of the steps. Luckily, for those of you who are not really keen, desperate, suicidally desperate to know more, well, I can point out some literature. So I shall cover only a couple of points, memory and the digital gaze, for two reasons. Memory, because that's Google for you, and the digital gaze, because that's Facebook for you. So, memory. Remember, personal identity is about a narrative, it's about memory, it's about managing information properly. It's not just about quantity, it's also quality. What is available and accessible of personal records. The trouble is that the more narratives are there, the more you become constrained. You become a fixed self. I said there is no time today, maybe during the Q&A, if you're curious, to discuss more at length what it means to fix the self. But anything that looks like profiling, or this constantly evolving work in progress that is the self, means freezing that self around a particular nature. If you are someone who has enjoyed Harry Potter Volume 1, well then Amazon will suggest that you're going to like Volume 2 and 3 and 4. And you become someone who has read all Harry Potter. Not because there were no alternatives, but because that profiling has frozen your nature around that particular sort of identity. How much freedom was there from someone who's constantly in progress? So the problem here is that the more memory there is, the less freedom we enjoy. In a way, the past used to be a time where we had a problem of recording something because it was very difficult. You would think twice before chiseling something on a stone. There's not kind of a delete kind of button at that point. But at the same time, we moved recently from a sort of culture of recording to a culture of forgetting. Everything gets recorded. Is what you want to forget that requires that extra effort. Those pictures on the iPhone that shouldn't be there because there is no more space in that iPhone. And by the way, more if you like, that experience is a world experience. We don't produce enough support for memories, for all memories to be recorded. So here, more memory means less self-dimensions, which means that the future will see more potential solutions, new and refined autobiographical skills, capturing, editing, saving, conserving, curating one's own memories for personal and public consumption. So at this point, and again, I'm being superficial, remember, I promise to be rather skimpy. The whole debate about the right to be forgotten, that is the way of approaching it. Do I have a right to be forgotten? Do I really want to have the right of making sure that some memories stays as memories? And yesterday we heard a little bit about closure. It wasn't framed exactly in terms of closure, but what is closure with respect to the past? Is remembering without recalling. That is closure. It's not forgetting. You don't want to forget what happened in Northern Ireland, but you want to remember in a way that doesn't reopen that wound that we were discussing again yesterday. There's a moment of healing that means growing out of a problem without forgetting the problem, but looking at a solution. So this is something that we can discuss if you like more, but we need to move forward because I want to tell you about the digital gaze and the final movement. So the digital gaze is famous among philosophers. It's something we've been discussing for a while: Lacan, Foucault, Sartre, feminist theory, the male gaze. In this particular case, I like to call it the digital gaze. Remember Facebook in the background? Because it's what's happening to us living on life, not typo included. We live on life when the question, are you online, are you offline, is no longer meaningful. As my students used to say, you must be from the 90s to ask that question. No, really? No, who is going online today? You're constantly online, or you're not, but that question doesn't make any sense anymore. If you live on life, there's a digital gaze that is constantly reverberating there. The self observes the observation of itself by other selves, including sometimes primarily itself, through some medium. That's what kids do all the time. What do I look like if I wear that chair looking at me? Who is me from the perspective of that chair? Or more simply, how does Jacob see me? Who am I in his eyes? And you do that, of course, with your spouse. Now, is this the best way of presenting myself to my wife? Is that the way she sees me? As, as arrogant or confident? Oh, that's so confident. So it's not like seeing oneself in a mirror. That's a different story. That's nothing to do with this. This is ego surfing or vanity googling. How many times a day you search Luciano Floridi, is anyone talking about me? That's not what I'm talking about here. It's seeing oneself as seen by others by using a mirror, for example. Say, oh, that's probably, the mirror tells me maybe that's the way they see me today. So this, which is quite ordinary in sort of child development, is something that stays with us after childhood now. We are constantly doing it through online mass media. The social media in which we are immersed, or some of us are, they are never turning off the digital gaze. We are constantly looking at how does Twitter tells me that I'm seen by other Twitters. And that's Facebook as well. Now, who is Luciano Floridi on Facebook according to the other friends, quote unquote, that you have on Facebook? So by its very nature, the digital gaze must be understood both as an instance of common knowledge. I know that you know that I know that you know that you know, and that's mathematical logic. We don't want to enter into that, but there is a specific branch called epistemology that deals with that kind of common knowledge, and as a private experience, because it's intrinsically who am I that I'm asking here. So at the same time, it's totally public, nothing more public than Facebook, but nothing more intimate than what I'm sharing on Facebook, in order to understand who am I, and this self as a work in progress gets shaped. So the self assumes that, or at least is trying to see how others sees itself. And the observing is normally hidden and not advertised. It's not what you do on Facebook. You never say, oh, by the way, I'm using Facebook in order to have a digital gaze, feedback on my identity. No, you are doing it in a sense of showing it rather than talking about it. It's a sort of Nike moment. Just do it. And the doing it will feed back into your particular nature. Remember that there's a social, a projected, and an internal self. The social self is what society tells us we are. The projected self is that what we think we are, and then there's you. who you really are. Society might tell you that you are funny. You may want to project yourself as a funny person, and all of a sudden you become a funny person because that's what society and yourself want to be, despite all the fact that you were so shy as a kid. So that sort of 1, 2, 3 and back, and 1, 2, 3 and back, that is what social media do through this digital gaze. So at some point, there's an on-tick feedback, or a feedback in terms of who we are. The digital gaze tends to be re-ontologizing, big words, to say it changes the intrinsic nature of the object, the very nature of the self that is subject to it. If you do too much digital gaze on someone who is fragile, you can actually kill that person. More on this if you like to hear actual cases of suicide caused by the digital gaze. There's a partiality here because the self sees itself from a third-person perspective through the observation of itself in a proxy, Facebook in this particular case, digital rather than analog, you name it, the next technology that you want, which gives you only a very partial, skewed way, not necessarily negative, but of a certain kind of feedback. And are we aware, meta-theoretically, that the kind of feedback that we're getting is a digital feedback, for example, where things may or may not be malleable to modification, for example? It is heterocentric. And of course, you put yourself in the eyes of the other person, which may not be a bad thing, but it's very dangerous. The experience of the digital gaze may start from a healthy and willful exploration and exposure by the self of itself through a medium, and that's okay. You put yourself in the eyes of the other to see yourself. But social pressure may force it on selves that are not yet ready, negatively affected by it, leading them to re-ontologize themselves heteronomously. In other words, less Kant, more practice, in a way that is dictated by external rules, not by yourself. Goodbye autonomy. You are what society and what you project yourself to be, as opposed to who you should really be. And finally, absorbing. The more powerful, pervasive, available ICTs, information and communication technologies become, the more the digital gaze may become mesmerizing. You get lost in one's own perception of oneself as attributed by others. So all of a sudden, who you are is just this enormous fragmented perspective from the others coming back. That's shallow in a sort of dangerous way. I promise to conclude all this with a self-reflection. So what's going on here? I gave you a couple of examples of what ICTs are doing to us. This self characterized as a very malleable work in progress. It's something that is so fragile and is exposed to a tsunami, a violent, a profoundly changing, massive influence. No wonder we feel like something is happening to us. We almost feel like violated by the sort of world in which we live. Now, we need protection, we need other ways of dealing with this. We are not prepared. Our culture has never prepared us to this particular corner. We are the transient generation. No one will ever perceive, as we have, the transformation from the analog to the digital. Other transformations will happen. Other wills will be invented in the future. But this particular will, we saw it happening. And we saw it happening faster than any other generation has ever seen anything else happening. The agricultural transformation took millennia to have an impact. The industrial centuries, the digital, 1 generation. We remember the world in which there were no mobile phones, in which there was black and white TV. So that world has changed under eyes. No wonder that we feel like a little bit under pressure, because that is the impact that it's having on ourselves. These technologies are not just about talking to mom through Skype. It's about who I am in the new world dominated by digital technology. So in this particular case, so what is all this happening under my eyes? Well, here I need another Greek philosopher. Sooner or later, he's either Greek or German. We all know that. And there's no way of escaping it. That is the ultimate game, as you know, from Monty Python. The Germans play with the Greeks, and we're just watching. Now, watching the great game, another great guy, Aristotle, he came up with this beautiful word, anagnorisis, and I'm almost at the end of the talk, so don't worry about it. Anagnorisis is almost untranslatable because it has 2 meanings at once. It means discovery, recognition, realization. Sometimes the best way to do is just to use the Greek word and say, well, it's what it is. What is it exactly? Now, if you have done studies in film studies, literature, and so on, you know this by heart, so forgive me for reminding you. It's the moment when the character realizes that something was deeply different in the interpretation of the whole story. Now, unfortunately, the best way of presenting this is through a tragic case. Oedipus, at some point, realizes what has happened. It's important to realize that this is not falsification. So something previously unforeseen is revealed, but nothing changes in the narrative. Let me give you a couple of examples that are more illustrative, and I hope I'm not ruining any movie for you. If you have watched The Sixth Sense, there is anagnorisis, and I won't tell you what's going on there if you haven't watched it. Disturbing. If you have watched the others, there is Aristotle trick, once again. Oedipus or Star Wars. They really love each other. They love each other so much. And you just can't figure out how it's going to be, because it's the three of them. And she and he, they love each other, but there's also another he. And then all of a sudden, oh goodness, I'm so glad they're siblings, yes! So we can have a squaring of the circle, and she and he, they can go together because the other two are brother and sister. Fantastic, that's Star Wars, and it's Aristotle again. Anagnorisis, because if you look back, you can watch all Star Wars, as we did recently with Kia, just to make sure that the logic was there, not for entertainment, and the whole story can be read in a way in which Luke is the brother of Layla, because nothing in the narrative is falsified. Anything that happens could be read in both ways, lovers or siblings. It's just the alternative that changes, but is a big change. So what happens here is that you have a point in time at the center of that line. You have an information flow, and the anagnorisis, this is not Aristotle, by the way, that's my own way of hijacking poor Aristotle in a different direction. But in that moment, you have an epistemic change, a transformation of understanding, such that a later stage in the information flow, the new acquisition of new information, forces the correct interpretation of the whole information flow. From that moment onwards, you can't go back to a sibling interpretation of Star Wars. That's gone. From that moment onwards, you cannot undo the fact that you killed your father and you married, or rather, to be frank, had sex with your mother. And that moment of truth reinterprets all the past. The gentleman you killed on the road, yeah, that was your father. Nothing changes in the facts, but interpretation is completely different. And the future will have to cope with that particular anagnorisis. Now, the trouble here is that we as selves, we heard yesterday the now. Well, the way I read that is that we are a constant flow of anagnorisis moments. Now, that may not be so incredibly enlightening, put it this way, but how many times have we reinterpreted everything with an Herculean effort to make sense of all our lives and say, oh, that's what it really meant. That person was not the love of my life. That was a mistake. This is me. No, that choice in my career, that was not an accident. It all made sense through. So we constantly, at that point, reinterpret the past and the future to make sense of ourselves. Whether that is a bit of a gorilla trick, if you were with us yesterday, or it really means that that's who we are, well, that is entirely left to our own sort of informational skills, how we regurgitate again and again and again our own selves, but also our Western history. Now, nothing, and that's another topic we won't touch today, nothing freezes more than all that amount of information or memory, or indeed history, as Nietzsche put so well. You have all that history in front of you, and that can actually be a great springboard or an anchor around your neck. Whether it's a springboard for future development or an anchor around your neck that sinks you to the deepest possible frozen inactivity, that's largely up to us. But back to us, so the process of progressive detachment of the self from the world, in a sort of Fichtean way, the non-self, is reconstructed by the self from the self perspective. And that's the ultimate meta-theoretical, philosophical anagnorisis that we've done through Western culture. Such perspective is inescapable. We can't avoid doing it. Remaking sense is like not seeing faces in the clouds. We can't help it, but we can be aware of that sort of particular moment. So in this, we can be critically aware of our skills and our inability to escape it. So once we realize that it is the self that is speaking about itself, then we may be able to appreciate that it's actually through the self that information becomes self-aware. In this particular world, we are the ultimate negation of entropy, through which information as patterns out there become aware. We are temporarily, as selves in this particular universe, the ones that are ephemeral but also essential for information to become self-conscious. So there are only information patterns in the world. In fact, the world is the ultimate, the totality of information patterns, Wittgensteinianly put. Some are things, some are organisms, and some are minds. But only minds, like ours, are able to interpret information patterns as things, as organisms, or selves. So we are special, but we are special because we are, in a way, a beautiful glitch. That one that we heard about yesterday, that is not in us, is between us and the world. It's that divide between us and the world that makes us who we are. And that sense of irrecoverable distance is precisely what makes us fly. Remember Aristotle? No, the dove who was so silly to think that if there were no air, she could fly more easily. That's stupid. Without that air, she couldn't fly at all. Without that gap, we wouldn't be ourselves. Eliminate that gap and you become just a spider, a dog. With that gap, you are human. Increase that gap and you're crazy. You become insane. You think you are Napoleon. So that is the way in which we should look at humanity as a non-fatal exception. So to the end, unprecedented phenomena in terms of ICT, in terms of construction of the self, means that self-poiesis, or the construction of the self today, is tinkering digitally with the self, with unknown and unassessed risks and rewards. We haven't been there before, and we're running huge risks and opportunities. We should move from egology, and that's my last slide, which is a more philosophical insight and better understanding who we are and how we construct ourselves, to an ecology of the self, so that ethics start playing a big role in our self-construction. And I hope I managed to provide a few insights on a very difficult topic. Thank you.